to another episode of the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. This is the podcast for those wanting to navigate the secular world with faith-based values. Your support keeps this podcast going, so thank you so much for taking time out of your day to join us. I'll pass it right over to Travis to introduce our guest and topic for today.
Thank you, Rigel, and thanks again, everybody, for tuning in to Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis. Today, we are joined again by our friend Braden, and the three of us are going to be talking about capitalism and Christianity, and more specifically, the uneasy truce between the two. So we're chatting the uneasy truce between capitalism and Christianity. Braden has joined us before, but for those of you who don't know Braden, I'll give a little background about him and why he's someone that we're interested to have chat with us about this topic specifically. So Braden is a former football player. He attended the University of Alberta before completing a degree at St. Mary's University in Calgary, after which he completed a degree in education. And he also studied for and passed the exams, part of the Chartered Financial Analyst program. He is an adult convert to the Catholic faith, and he was baptized and confirmed into the Catholic Church in 2016. He is passionate about finance and capital markets. He is an active personal investor, and he helps finance professionals prepare for the Chartered Financial Analyst exams. So, Braden, thank you again for joining us on the podcast.
Thanks again for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So, as we always do, we will start the conversation with a quote or a passage from someone much wiser than we are to guide the conversation that we're having today. And today, again, the topic being Christianity and capitalism. We're going to turn to one of the papal encyclicals. So a document written by the Pope on a matter of sufficient urgency that they feel the need to address it. And the one we're going to turn to is from the year 1891. The encyclical written by Pope Leo XIII is Rerum Novarum, which for those of you who are not experts in Latin, which is almost all of us, Rerum Novarum simply means on labor and capital. And this encyclical is important for a lot of reasons, one of which is that this is effectively when the Catholic social thought or Catholic social teaching tradition started. And for those of you who don't know, Catholic social teaching is effectively the Catholic Church's way of addressing issues related to things like capitalism, socialism, economics, etc. And so we're going to start here with a passage from Pope Leo XIII in Rerum Novarum. By degrees, it has come to pass that working men have been surrendered, isolated, and helpless to the hard-heartedness of employers and the greed of unchecked competition. The mischief has been increased by rapacious usury, which, although more than once condemned by the Church, is nevertheless, under a different guise, but with like injustice, still practiced by covetous and grasping men. To this must be added that the hiring of labor and the conduct of trade are concentrated in the hands of comparatively few, so that a small number of very rich men have been able to lay upon the teeming masses of the laboring poor a yoke little better than that of slavery itself. To remedy these wrongs, the socialists, working on the poor man's envy of the rich, are striving to do away with private property and contend that individual possessions should become the common property of all, to be administered by the state. They are emphatically unjust, for they would rob the lawful possessor, distort the functions of the state, and create utter confusion in the community. By endeavoring to transfer the possessions of individuals to the community at large, socialists strike at the very interests of every wage earner, since they would deprive him of the liberty of disposing of his wages and thereby of all hope and possibility of increasing his resources and of bettering his condition in life. So that is from Rerum Novarum, and it hints at, or explicitly gets at, the Catholic Church's position, which makes enemies of effectively everybody on the far left and the far right of the economic spectrum, which is really just the Church doing what it's there to do, which is focus on things above the here and now, above the purely material, and allow us to conduct ourselves in economic matters, valuing things that are eternal. And so this passage highlights that the Church is neither fiercely pro-capitalism or fiercely pro-socialism. It identifies problems with both. And what we're going to talk about today with Braden is the challenge that Christianity and capitalism when they're brought together face. And so, Braden, maybe to start us off, if you can, for the benefit of our listeners, when we talk about capitalism, what are we even discussing?
Awesome. Well, thanks for that, Travis. I think that encyclical Rerum Novarum, it is pretty apt to bring that up. I think we'll probably refer back to that a couple of times during this conversation. What is capitalism? I think we can define capitalism essentially as the private ownership of the means of production, right? The private ownership of capital. That's, I think, the key distinction that Adam Smith, who is often regarded as the father of capitalism, was driving at in his work in the late 18th century, The Wealth of Nations. He was trying to essentially offer a critique on how things had been previously. Now, in Western Europe, it's important to distinguish that he was making a critique about how things had been in Western Europe at the time. Now, prior to this work, the dominant kind of political economic system that was in place was mercantilist system that really focused on material wealth, and in particular the wealth of the country, the wealth of the sovereign, not really the wealth of the citizens. So in his work, The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith, the Scottish economist, philosopher, professor, sets out that it's not necessarily just scarcity that makes something valuable. It's also related to the labor that it takes to procure it. And in that, he essentially establishes that there is a greater role for the public citizenry to play. And that's why private ownership should be desired.
I think your last comment there is very critical for people to understand. Capitalism, like so many things, is very poorly understood by the average person. Even many people who are advocates for capitalism don't even understand what it is that they're talking about. And we have the benefit, perhaps the three of us being people that not just have an interest in the practice of finance specifically, which is the mechanism by which capitalism effectively functions, but even we sometimes will forget what capitalism actually is. For our listeners, I think the most important thing is what you mentioned at the end there, Braden, which is capitalism depends upon the idea that private property is something that we can hold. And we take that very for granted. Even people today, especially in the Western world, who are sympathetic to arguments that are anti-capitalistic or socialistic, they take for granted that private property and the respect thereof is something that we have. And that is what a capitalist system allows for. The idea that we as individuals can have ownership over things. It is not the state that owns things and then determines who can own what, potentially nothing at all.
And just speaking to how people don't actually understand the full extent of certain philosophies, it's impossible. Even if you are a capitalist, if you don't fully understand what socialism is, you might think that unless you're for unrestrained capitalism, you're a socialist. But that's not true. And I just had this conversation with a friend yesterday. He calls himself a capitalist, but because he understands that there are downsides to capitalism and unrestrained capitalism isn't good, his friends call him a socialist. And so it's just way too common.
And I'll add to that, I think it's very common, and the three of us come to this conversation largely from, if not explicitly from, the Catholic tradition. But we're talking about Christianity in general. And it's important for us to appreciate as we talk about this, that modern capitalism effectively grew out of a very Protestant Christianity worldview. That's very much the case. That's not to say it was good or bad necessarily, but that is the case, that modern capitalism, especially as it's championed and spread around the world by first and foremost the United States and the United Kingdom, and then other countries that are structured similar to them economically, that grows out of a fiercely pro-Protestant worldview, not a Catholic worldview. And I think that's relevant because even if we look at the world of, say, politics, the Catholic Church's teaching on politics is not fiercely pro-democratic, although many people think that. They just assume that democracy is necessarily the only system of government that it has any good in it. And that's not what the Catholic Church teaches. The Church teaches that the Church can operate with all sorts of systems of government. It's focused on other things, but it can in fact work with monarchies, even benevolent dictatorships, et cetera, et cetera. And so similarly, the Catholic Church teaching about the Christian faith when it comes to matters of economics is not to be fiercely pro-capitalist, as if that's the only thing that works. It's to focus on the things that do matter within any system of economics, capitalism being one of the potential systems.
So maybe I'll ask the question of what is your understanding of the Catholic Church's view on capitalism, and how does that compare to maybe more of a secular understanding of capitalism and how it should be applied?
Okay, I think kind of taking that question and kind of piggybacking on the comments just made by Travis, I think the Catholic Church's stance on capitalism is, I think, more so that it does align with, in a lot of ways, it does align with the Catholic social teachings. I think that it is more aligned with respecting or providing the potential to respect the dignity and the freedom of the individual. So that is something that I think the Church strongly values. And I believe that a capitalist system does provide a great opportunity for the individual, for them to exercise their free will, for them to be fruitful, for them to, have something that they can contribute to those around them, and it doesn't, compromise their dignity. It does it. It's a very complex topic, I guess. So it's not easy to outright say, what does the Catholic Church think about capitalism? I think my understanding is that it recognizes a lot of good in a capitalist system, but also recognizes that in reality, the way that things play out often can conflict with the teachings of the Church and conflict with what we would hope for.
And maybe in some ways it's maybe easier to define what the Catholic Church's teaching on capitalism or economics generally is not, rather than what it is. And so, as an example, we could contrast the Catholic Church's perennial teachings on matters related to finance, business, and wealth with a more recent phenomenon that has grown out of specifically North American evangelical Christianity, which is prosperity gospel or prosperity theology. And for those of you who have never heard about this, it's something I'm somewhat familiar with, largely just because of the tradition that I was raised in. And not that this is something that was talked about a lot, but I'm familiar with it because of that. And so prosperity theology or prosperity gospel is effectively a belief, a religious belief among many evangelical Protestant Christians, mostly of a Pentecostal or charismatic nature, not universally, that's not to generalize, but that's where the movement comes from, which basically teaches that financial blessing and physical well-being are always the will of God for them, and that faith, positive speech, positive thinking, and donations to religious causes will increase one's material wealth. And so that last piece is the dangerous piece, because it effectively focuses someone's religious life and prayer life and actions not towards God for the purposes of eternity, salvation, because it's God's desire for our life, but it's
Spiritual wealth.
Exactly that. And so I think that's a great contrast. So Braden, maybe with that in mind of what prosperity gospel stuff is, that's not what we're talking about when we try to address the potential clash between Christianity and capitalism, is trying to understand how capitalism can be consistent with fulsome Christianity, but how it's not necessarily an easy thing to reconcile.
I guess where I would start with that is I would think about the teachings of Christ and the gospel, and I think that if you are prioritizing wealth and putting a spin on that and thinking that, if somebody has had great success financially, then they must be blessed by God. I think that if you are focusing on the wealth, if that is your priority, if that's where you place your value, then and your focus, then you're kind of missing a lot of what Christ came to teach, right? And the idea that in that instance, you're essentially potentially worshiping mammon, right? You're focused on wealth and potentially greed and avarice, right? And he said you can't serve God and serve mammon, right? You can't worship both. So I think that there are probably a lot of people out there who are followers of Christ but miss a lot of that message, right? You're supposed to store up your wealth in heaven, right, where rust and moths cannot destroy it, right, where it's not susceptible to the trials of this earthly life, and that should be your priority. And how do you do that? You do that by following the teachings of Christ, by thinking about what it means to live virtuously and what it means to come from a place with the Beatitudes, at the forefront, and conduct yourself in a way that aligns with those teachings. And if in doing that you're able to have success and procure wealth, then that's great. But if again, it comes down to intent, it comes down to priority, it comes down to what your heart is focused on.
I mean, it's literally in the Bible, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So, if we are placing all value in material possession and, wealth here on earth, that's what we're going to chase after. But ultimately, I think capitalism from a Catholic perspective is your treasure should always be in heaven. And that's where our hearts should be as well. So, like you said, Braden, we might do really well, but we might not. And we should be okay with that. The wealth or success here on earth should be a byproduct of our behaviors and actions as Catholics. Meaning, you might be a business owner, but putting people first, making sure you treat your clients and customers with the proper dignity that they deserve, and your business thereby doing really well. Nothing wrong with that. But doing the opposite, treating your clients and customers really poorly, trying to cheat them, or, treating them unfairly in order to do well, I think there's a huge difference between that. And I think that's where Catholic social teaching comes in.
That's exactly right, Rigel. And we all know, irrespective of what Christian tradition you come from, that there is no guarantee in the Gospels of material prosperity, of material wealth, nor should we have any reason, unless you're going to explicitly manipulate the words, the literal words that Christ is recorded as having said. There is no reason to believe that we won't suffer and struggle in this life. And for many people, that suffering and struggle can be material poverty, the very opposite of what a capitalist system can provide for, which is material prosperity. And so I think that is something that gets lost, is the Catholic Church probably looks at capitalism as the system of economic organization, as the one that best facilitates what it is to respect the dignity of the human person, allow for private property, allow for them to provide for the material needs of those entrusted to their care by God, including first and foremost family, other members of the Christian community, etc. But that doesn't mean that it can't go wrong. And I think that's where the need to reconcile Christianity and capitalism, hence why we called this episode the Uneasy Truce, is that the capitalism can be taken too far, and often is taken too far, where it becomes almost irreconcilable with Christianity, even though the church's teaching is that it is consistent with Christianity when checks and balances are in place. Is that fair in your opinion, Braden? Is that fair to say?
I think that's definitely fair to say. And I think, if you don't mind me kind of going on this thought for a little bit here, I think that in 1891, in Rerum Novarum, Pope Leo XIII as you mentioned, was responding to the times and was responding to some of the Marxist ideas, the ideologies that were being pushed by some, and he lays out that private property is in line with natural law, right? That we as people are called to be fruitful, to work the land, to cultivate, and with that, when we put our effort into the land, we should, in line with what is just, we should be able to enjoy the fruit of that labor, right? And we shouldn't feel like we are going to be compromised or jeopardized in any way from doing so. And that, I think, is at the heart of why capitalism does provide the greatest opportunity. But with that said, I think the reason why capitalism sometimes falls short and can be problematic is because the essence of capitalism is really about freedom. It provides freedom, it provides opportunity, it provides choice, just as our Lord provided us with free will, provides us with choice. But the fundamental issue is really in our hearts. It's the tendency to sin, right? The ability to make the wrong choice. And when we have this freedom because of a capitalist system, when people's incentives are misaligned or their priorities aren't in the right place, then we get people being treated as a means to an end and their dignity being compromised. And that's the problem that we are faced with, this exploitative nature, because people are not prioritizing the wealth in heaven.
And one thing that I'll actually draw direct reference from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which for those people who are listening who are not Catholics, the Catechism is effectively a consolidated guide to the Catholic Church's teachings on the most important things. And that does include things that matter from an economic perspective and are applicable to all of us, especially if we're living in the Western world where we take a capitalistic system of economic organization for granted because we know nothing else. But the highlighted issue that the Catechism draws attention to in paragraph 2425 points to the inherent nature of capitalism to focus on individualism and even radical individualism at the expense of, and this should seem obvious, but at the expense of community and loving one's neighbor. And so I think we see that the worst excesses of capitalism can often be tied directly to a radical individualistic nature, which is indeed very hard to reconcile with the gospel message of love for one's neighbor, especially when one's neighbor might in fact be materialistically very poor and in desperate need. Rigel, I know you didn't grow up in India, but you come from India, which anyone who's ever been to India, I haven't, but I know enough people who have, anyone who's ever been to India can speak to the level of poverty that exists there. Maybe you can speak to a little bit about that, because I think we see that, and people that are living lives where dignity is not something that they can claim to be receiving. That is something that a capitalistic system can, when left unchecked, lead to is insane levels of poverty and almost callousness when people look at those who are suffering materially.
This is actually a really timely question because I just returned from a trip to India. And it was during this trip, maybe I've just reached the level of emotional maturity that I needed, but I realized just how privileged not only myself, but my entire family is. Um, we, we spent a lot of time going to various families' houses, extended family members and such. And all of them have really nice houses, far nicer houses than we actually have here. But it is quite obvious that there is a huge gap in income inequality, and not just income, but actually just wealth inequality. On the one hand, we know families who have so much money that they complain that they don't know what to do with it. And on the other hand, you have families that struggle to feed themselves every day. I'll confess I don't know nearly enough of the families on the other hand, but I do have some extended family that do live in those circumstances. I don't really know what I would speak to on the topic, just because I don't know how the economic or political system works there. Yeah, I don't really know what more I would add.
I would say that the fact that you can have situations like you encounter in India and like I encounter when I visit my wife's family in Colombia. For those that don't know, Colombia is among the most unequal countries on earth. It's probably not as unequal as India is, but it's not far off. And the crazy thing about that is Colombia is also supposedly one of the most Catholic, i.e., Christian countries in the world. And those two things shouldn't go hand in hand. If people are taking our Lord and Savior's teaching seriously as related in the gospel and loving one's neighbor, that also implies helping provide for one's neighbor's physical needs, material needs, food, shelter, etc., being first and foremost among them. And you go to a place like Colombia, and there's other places in the world too, where you have a lot of people that are claiming to be Christians and maybe think of themselves as truly committed Christians. And yet the excesses of capitalism have allowed for them to very easily turn a blind eye to suffering that is right beside them, and yet continue to go about their lives as if they are somehow sharing the love of Christ with those that they encounter. And so I think that is a highlighting of the risk of capitalism and how it can be hard to reconcile with proper Christianity when fulsomely understood. I know, Braden, you've never been, to my knowledge, to either India or Colombia, but you also, being someone that's interested in and knowledgeable about capitalism, financial markets, and stuff, you can see the conflict that our faith and the economic system we operate within, how much tension there can be between the two. But I'm sure that you wouldn't argue for socialism, which is a condemned heresy of the church, obviously. So you would probably reluctantly agree is capitalism is the best that we have. So maybe if you can talk a little bit about the reasons that capitalism is the best alternative that we have and why it is the one that's most consistent with Christian teaching.
Okay, sure. So, yes, I think it is important to recognize the levels of inequality that exist globally and how capitalism hasn't completely solved that issue. And I think that we need to be aware that there obviously are flaws within capitalism as it has been practiced. But at the end of the day, I think it really boils down to the concepts of power and who holds the power, who gets to control the resources, who gets to make these decisions. And again, back when Adam Smith in the 1770s published his defining work, Wealth of Nations, he was critiquing what had existed prior, and in the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, and coming up with this idea that private ownership of the means of production would be a net positive. It wasn't necessarily believed that all inequality would be eradicated as soon as this began to be implemented, right? But that said, there is data that shows that the middle class in a lot of these countries like India is growing, right? And even if there is this large divide, the fact that there is a middle class that is growing shows that there are people who are making a move from the lower class into the middle class, right? And the question really is, in other systems that we know of, would there be the same likelihood that would be occurring, right? Who, again, if we go back to the idea of who holds the power, I know a lot of people like to think in an idealistic sense that a socialist kind of society where everybody is cared for and everybody's treated equally would be the ideal, would be good, but as you mentioned, it's condemned by the church. Why is it condemned by the church? Well, it's not just because of the history, which is obviously very problematic. Okay, it's also because if you are you are naturally going to have to impede upon people's freedoms, right? If you are going, I think people make the mistake to think that a socialist society there is going to be nobody who is in control and nobody who has power. No, you're just changing who is in control and who has power, and you're changing who has the opportunity to get that power, right? And I think a lot of the most tragic instances of an attempt to implement, Marxist ideals in history, like I think of, what happened in Mao's China, what happened in, the Soviet Union, Lenin, and then Stalin. I think of Pol Pot's Cambodia. Like, these people all were coming from this idealistic way of thinking in which they didn't engage with the world as it is. They didn't engage with human society as it is, right? And like when we're talking about the virtues, that is not prudent, right? Prudence is about seeing the world as it is and engaging with it, right? And acting accordingly. And a lot of these people with these socialist ideals aren't really considering what human nature is, what the natural law is, what society actually is.
And I want to interject there a little bit to make sure people really understand what socialism is and what it isn't, because it is the thing that's most often contrasted with capitalism. People will mistakenly refer to the early Christians as if they were socialists. And I will laugh in the face of people. The next person that makes that mistake to me, I don't know if I'll be able to restrain myself, because I will feel the need to, I'll try to politely but firmly educate them on what socialism actually is. Socialism, the worldview that comes from Marxism, Karl Marx, is explicitly atheistic. It denies, by definition, God's existence. Reconcile Christianity with socialism. Go. Any person on earth that can reconcile a worldview that says God doesn't exist with God's only son came, go. Prove to me that you can reconcile that. Can't be done. Not possible. What socialism actually is this idea that individual people cannot, should not, will not, whatever, have decision-making ability, authority over what they own because they can't own anything, what they spend their time doing because the state decides. And so, practically speaking, if you're a socialist, if you believe you're a socialist, you have to be okay with the idea that wherever you live, wherever you reside with your family, that someone can show up at your door, open the door, because you don't own that place. They can open the door for wherever you live, and they can tell you who's going to sleep in the room next to you, maybe with your children, because they control that too. That is what socialism actually is. And so it doesn't mean that there aren't good things that socialism aims at, because it identifies inequalities and profound injustice in the world, but the ends don't justify the means. And people forget that. I don't think there's a single person in the history of the world who's actually been a real socialist in practice. Just a lot of people that talk about the good ideas that socialism's aiming after without understanding what it logically requires. Braden, I don't know if you want to add anything to that, but I think it's important to point that out because capitalism is often contrasted with socialism, and there is no evidence whatsoever that socialism leads to positive outcomes.
Just one quick thing, Braden, before I pass it over to you. I think this is also the problem with putting ideas into buckets. We have capitalism in one and socialism in the other. Truth is, the best outcome is probably somewhere in between, but we had to separate the ideas into two separate buckets. And so now it's kind of become one or the other, not like some combination of both. Sorry, Braden, over to you.
I think it's important, as you mentioned, Travis, to actually get at the heart of what socialism is about and where it began. And a lot of people will look at the examples that I presented with Stalin and Pol Pot's Cambodia, and they'll say, no, that's communism. That's not socialism. Socialism is something much nicer. But Karl Marx, in the mid to late 19th century, he states that socialism is the next step after capitalism and the step before communism. he states that this is a step along the way, right? And his intention was to create a classless society, right? We, as you mentioned, we can look at the nice ideas and the apparent good in some of what these people want to prioritize and want to have done, and we can see the value and the good in it. But you can look at what Marx was all about and what he stated, and he was looking at a lot of the exploitative tendencies that he was seeing in this industrious capitalist society, and he was identifying those same issues and how he would address those same issues. But what people don't realize is he was also writing satanic poetry, and he was also a staunch atheist, and he was also not willing to work himself, right? So the irony of somebody who considers himself an intellectual and isn't going to get his hands dirty, telling everybody else that they need to get their hands dirty and they need to revolt and they need to overthrow the classes, we can't overlook that is the heart and the root of this way of thinking, right? I think that, again, there's a lot of good in what a lot of these people desire. They identify a lot of the shortcomings that have been present in how capitalism has been practiced, but I feel like they kind of consistently move the goalposts, right? No, that's not socialism. This is what I mean by socialism. No, that's not socialism. This is what I mean by socialism. But then they don't offer the same grace to people who are in favor of capitalism. I can't say, no, that's not real capitalism. This is what capitalism is actually supposed to be, because all capitalism is evil. There's one more thing that I want to say on this, and maybe I'm getting a little fired up and a little emotional, and maybe I should just tone it down a little bit. But I often find that the people who are speaking out against capitalism also speak out against colonization, colonialism, and there's a lot of injustice. Don't take me the wrong way here in that history, but colonialism started in the late 15th, 16th century, right? Capitalism wasn't on the scene for another couple hundred years. So capitalism was actually addressing a lot of the underlying philosophy that was driving colonialism, right? Capitalism then obviously became involved as well in looking for markets and things, but I just think that there's a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of maybe ignorance around the history, and it is troublesome.
I'm glad that you brought that up. I think it's incumbent upon us, if we're going to have firm opinions and views about all sorts of things, including things of a political or economic nature like we're talking right now. If we're going to have strong opinions on them, we should probably make sure we actually understand them. And I say that to myself as much as anybody. I used to have incredibly strong pro-capitalist views, and I'm still a capitalist because there's no other good option that I've ever encountered that is consistent with my faith. This is, and maybe the best way to phrase it is, capitalism is the worst system except for all the other ones. That's how I would describe it. Is it's probably the only system of economic organization based upon what the world is today, taking the world as it is. If there was no such thing as technology, if there was no such thing as borders between countries, if we could undo the world as it is, sure, maybe there'd be an alternative way of organizing trade and commerce between individuals and communities. But that's not realistic. So we have what we have. And given what we have, capitalism is probably the only system of economic organization that is actually consistent with a Christian worldview. So if we take that as our starting point, because you have to rule out, for the reasons we've talked about, you have to rule out socialism, communism, whatever terminology you want. And you probably want to focus on having a system of capitalism that is consistent with the Christian faith on the individual level. That requires us as individual Christians in a capitalist system doing certain things, right? Simple examples. Don't evade taxes. Pay your taxes, as a good example. It's amazing how many people don't even realize that and try to evade taxes and then call themselves Christians. Okay, whatever. But you, even if you're going to think about, giving to charitable causes, there's no minimum Like, you could choose to be extra generous. If you've done very well financially, you could go above and beyond what your neighbors are doing, right? There's no rule that says in a capitalist system you can't be more generous than other people. So as a Christian, you can make those individual decisions to mimic Christ in your daily life. So maybe Braden and Rigel, I'd love for each of you to speak to, for you as individuals. We live in Canada, capitalist economy. We're heavily influenced by other parts of the Anglosphere, which are also capitalist economies. For you as individual capitalist Christians, what are things that you do right now that you think others can learn from, or things that you think you need to do better so that you can live Christian lives in a capitalist system?
One of the things that I'm highly motivated to do, even though I'm not doing it right now, is to actually just start a business. One of the things, especially for people who have experienced some kind of social mobility, but also people who are benefiting from being middle class or upper class, um, you have some level of financial freedom. At least there is some give in your disposable income. So being able to start a business and empower someone who doesn't have the option of social mobility, to give them an opportunity. I think creation of opportunity, I think, is something that's really important. And it takes a lot of forms. I'm particularly motivated by the idea of starting a business, creating employment opportunities for people where they might not have an employment opportunity otherwise. But another good example is setting up a scholarship for someone who would never be able to afford, post-secondary education or education in general. I think those are some good examples of things that I'm highly motivated to do. Things that I'm doing right now is honestly not enough. Um, I give to the church and stuff, but there's so many other causes that deserve attention. Um, I think exactly like you said, Travis, just being more generous. Um, of course, we're always striving to earn more for ourselves and earn more for our families and stuff. But at the same time, we should, as our income and wealth is growing, we should be keeping our expenses low, um, and managing those things so that we can be more generous, so that there is more margin for us to do things for others, and help them to achieve things that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. Freedom, as Braden mentioned before.
Yeah, I like that. I agree. I think, I'm kind of in a similar position. I have, what I do, and I don't think it's enough and anywhere near enough, but, I give regularly to the church. And I think part of the intention behind that is not just to support the church, but also that if I'm going to try to support the community, I know that the church is involved in the community and that they are going to um, run programs that are going to help those who have need. And so I'd rather give money there than necessarily give money to some different organizations that exist. I think starting a business is a wonderful idea. I think if I were to look to start a business, I think it would be around personal finance. I think one of the biggest issues that people face is they feel that the capitalist system doesn't work for them, right? It's failed them, and I think a big part of that is education based, right? I know there are a lot of people out there who are doing similar things. I think that that's a big part of it. If I could give time and my knowledge and help, like that is something that I aim to do. And then last thing I'll say is I'd also like to see some kind of option to invest capital into uh, into different causes, into different investments that align with the teachings of the church and can help people who need a hand.
And I'll add to that. I'll provide an answer to my own question, just to be an egomaniac, but also because I think it's a way to help people realize that in a capitalist economy, if you're a Christian, your way of showing love doesn't only have to be monetary. It isn't only tied to you sharing your material prosperity, assuming you've earned some, which of course that's part of it. And as you guys have talked about, we should be generous. We have to be generous because there are so many people who oftentimes, if not always, through no fault of their own, are less materially well off. But it can be more than that. So I'll give two examples that I could do better and I need to try to do better, but I am trying because my wife was a refugee to this country. And so she came here as a child with effectively nothing. And so since I've met my wife, I become far more aware of the plight of the refugee. And there are so many of them in the world, and many of them end up in Canada in our communities. And one thing that I become very aware of is yes, there's jobs available here for sure. And we can talk a lot about how much, the need for more immigration to support our economy and everything. That doesn't mean for individual people here finding a job it's easy. There's not jobs just being thrown at them. There are things that they need to do to find those jobs, often basic things like having a resume that an employer even wants to look at. And so one thing I have tried to do is be willing to review people's resumes for them, especially people that English isn't their first language, because competing for jobs is part of being in a capitalist system. So helping people have a chance to compete for those jobs by making sure their resume even conforms to the standards that we have here is a relatively simple thing to do that doesn't impose a huge burden on me beyond a little bit of time. And it can make a huge difference in the lives of other people, many of whom have come here as Christians, and I need to love them and show love to them. So that's one thing that has no financial requirement whatsoever, but is born of a need from a capitalist economy. Question that I want to pose to each of you. As Christians and as people may be struggling at times to live those values within a Catholic or within a capitalist economy, if you could change one thing about capitalism as it's practiced, let's say in Canada where we live, if you could change one thing about capitalism as it's practiced in Canada, what would that one thing be? I'll let you guys go first, and then I'll share my own answer to that one change I would like to see.
I think I'd like to see a change of heart. I think that that's the biggest thing. I think that, with the capitalist system, we prioritize profit, right? It's profit motive driven. And with that, we are driven to supply what the masses want, right? And we think about what they want. But in order to generate as much profit for us as we can. But I think that that is not a very Christian way of thinking. I think the right thing to do would be to think about what the people need, not necessarily what they want, right? We're called to love our neighbor, not to gratify our neighbor, to love our neighbor, right? And with that, the Catholic Church teaches that to love someone is to will the good of the other, right? It's not just a feeling, it's to will their good, it's to want what is good for them. So a big part of it is to know about what is good and to tie that to what people need and to focus on that. And you know what? I think if we did more of that, we would still have a lot of success and we would create a better world, a better society, right? Rather than this growth at all costs mentality, thinking about what is best for those around us and what can meet those needs in the best way. I think that would be the change that I would like to see.
I think I'm pretty aligned with that, but from two different perspectives. One is more of a corporate perspective because we have this corporate policy of maximizing shareholder value as being like the priority, right? And a lot of the time that comes at the expense of treating people as human beings and giving them the dignity that they deserve. The other perspective is just the individual perspective. Like, yes, people have done extremely well doing various things, but switching over from like a heart of greed to just more charity, more serving others, I think that's a change that I would want to see. I see a lot of people who have like 9 or 10 investment properties, and sure, that's great. Like, diversify your portfolio for sure, but do you really need 9 or 10 investment properties? Or even if you do have that, are you offering affordable rent so that people can actually have housing, or are you prioritizing your income stream? I think that change of heart at the individual level is really important and a change I'd like to see as well.
Yeah, that's great. I will add to that. I think I'm going to make a reference I've made before, and I'm drawing upon a movie, Jurassic Park, and I'm going to tweak a line from the movie. So in the movie, Dr. Ian Malcolm says, "Your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." And I'm going to tweak it, and I'm going to say, "Your capitalists were so preoccupied with whether or not they could, they didn't stop to think if they should." And the reason I think that that's sort of relevant is there is a lot of capitalism for the sake of capitalism. And by that, I mean things like cryptocurrencies and NFTs and all that stuff. And I don't want to hear the arguments. The people that are going to argue those things against me, it's unlikely that you understand them better than I do. Given my work experience, Rigel, yours too, given the people that we did business with for many years, given the transactions we've been involved in, it is highly unlikely that if you're going to argue the benefits of those things, you understand them better than I do. That doesn't mean there aren't things I don't know. And that doesn't mean that there aren't potentially valuable benefits of technologies and stuff coming from the world of crypto and NFTs and everything. But I think any rational person looks at the lion's share of stories about stuff in the world of cryptocurrencies, and you see that most of that stuff is just because. There's no real benefit. It doesn't actually add value to anybody's life. It is irreconcilable with the idea of loving neighbor. It is purely to make a profit, almost always, with no societal benefit involved. And that to me is a perversion of capitalism, that if I could change one thing, that would probably be the thing. And that might look like a reallocation of resources towards more productive things that can benefit more people in material ways. And I don't know how to bring that about, but I think using those examples, we can see that there are, in fact, things that are part of our capitalist system that are, it's just money for the sake of money. And there's no argument around that, despite what people are going to say, because it's beneficial for them to argue while they're making money off of propagating these technologies.
One thing I want to say about that, because I can already feel the arguments forming in my own head, is that cryptocurrencies is a really good example. Like take Bitcoin, for example. It was created for a reason, limited money supply, which is what our currencies were supposed to be, and just the reckless handling of our money supply by our government, just insane printing of money, causing inflation, and just poor management without a thought for the consequences that will follow, resulted in this idea of Bitcoin as a currency and the value that people see in it, because it is, as a rule, limited in supply. Now, does that benefit actually go to the people who need it most? I think no, because if you're able to invest in Bitcoin, you probably already have investments and you're probably already somewhat safeguarded against inflation. But the people who don't have investments and only have their cash, maybe don't even have a bank account, they probably don't have Bitcoin holdings. So it's not benefiting them and they're still suffering. So, we can always argue the merits of cryptocurrencies versus how it's actually being used. But I just wanted to make that distinction.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Rigel, and I appreciate that. And I've used this example before about the potential benefits of blockchain technology, which facilitates things like cryptocurrencies. And I'm still really optimistic about the potential long-term benefits of blockchain technology, especially even I think about the potential applications in Colombia, which I know quite a bit about, and its use within the real estate uh, industry in Colombia. And I'll share one quick example. My wife's family owned a farm in Colombia, and they effectively had to abandon their family farm because of threat of violence. And so they left. And what's happened in the 20 plus years since they left, they still own the land. They still own this farm, but they haven't been able to live there again because it's too dangerous. But they still own the land. They want to sell the land now. And we've come to learn in the last year that they actually can't sell the land because someone who didn't own the land has been living on a part of it for the last number of years. And that person just went into the municipal office and changed the legal documents by paying a little fee. And now they claim that they own part of the land that they don't own. And there's almost no way to reconcile this issue. People don't remember. People have passed away. People have moved on. And so it's a matter of he said, she said. And now the family farm that my wife's grandparents want to sell, they can't sell. Blockchain technology could make that a non-issue. It would allow for the records to be very clearly stated, and they can't be documented or changed, by someone randomly walking into an office one day. That's a potential application for real people, average people, poor people to benefit from this technology that is radically disconnected from all the pump and dump schemes and all that kind of stuff that we see blockchain technology being utilized for. So I appreciate the distinction, Rigel, and you're absolutely right. And I think we need to be aware of those differences. Rigel, how do you want to wrap up the conversation here with Braden?
Braden, do you have any final takeaways before we wrap up in prayer?
Yeah, one thing that I'd like to mention to wrap up this chat. I think an important point about capitalism and what it allows us and what it affords us is by identifying that value isn't something that is just inherent in a material because it is scarce, but that it can actually be created. That was really the big shift, is that value can be created. Everything doesn't have to be zero sum. We can have a positive sum interaction because true value can be created. I think that aligns very well with the teachings of Christ, with the Catholic Church and Christianity in general, because we are made in the image of God, right? Imago Dei, right? We are made in the image of God, and God is a creator, right? So the fact that we can tie value to the ability to create, to make new things, to come up with new ideas. Just think about intangible assets on the balance sheet, right? Like, there is real value in what we create, and I don't think that other systems that have existed really acknowledge that or are based upon that and allow us to foster that. And that is something that is fundamental in what it is to be human, and something that needs to be respected. And yeah, I think that's an important point to make before we finish up.
Thanks, Braden. And so maybe to wrap up the conversation and to highlight sort of the things that we've talked about, capitalism is imperfect, but it is imperfect largely because individual people operating within a capitalist system choose to do things that are obviously inconsistent with Christian values and the Christian faith. And if we in fact had, you don't even necessarily need a majority. You could just have a strong minority of people within a capitalist system adhering to Christian values. You could actually see a system, I'd like to think, of economic organization that truly does work for the vast majority of people. I think that's possible. And of course, that's where it gets difficult, is are there enough people in our societies to adhere to those values? And I don't know. I'm skeptical. I'm prone to be despondent about things, and so I don't know that that's the case. But I'm also called to be hopeful, and I think a capitalist system can be used to organize economic activity consistent with Christian values, consistent with the church's teachings, in such a way that individual people can show love to neighbor and do so in a way that isn't radically individualistic and isn't needlessly focused on material prosperity, and can provide for the needs of those who are less fortunate, while also focusing on eternal values, which is where our attention ought to be as Christians, and we know that. Rigel, do you want to wrap us up with prayer?
In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, we give you all thanks and praise. We thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for the ability to have these discussions that we can then go on to share with the world. In your eyes, we are neither knowledgeable nor wise. We depend on you for both. Please lend those to us when we have these conversations. Help what we're saying be useful to those who are listening. Help us to have some small impact on other people that inspire them to lead better lives, to bring them closer to you, and to center their lives around you. We pray this in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thanks, Rigel. for leading us in prayer. Thanks, Braden, for joining us, for having this conversation with us. If you're out there and you're listening and you have ideas about a future topic on the same vein as this conversation with respect to capitalism and Christianity and the conflicts or uneasy truce between them, please reach out to us. We'd love your feedback. And until next time, thank you for listening. This has been the Coffee, Commerce, and Catechesis podcast. God bless you. We'll see you next time.